So, Prince of Persia is a video game franchise that began in 1989 with the original video game simply titled Prince of Persia. And that classic game is well known today for its rotoscope animation and its trap-based level design. The game was a critical and commercial success, part of which could probably be attributed to its assload of ports. And it was successful enough that it ended up getting 2 sequels. The first one, Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame, was released in 1993, and that game was incredibly similar to the first. And the second, Prince of Persia 3D, was released in 1999, which, as the name implies, was the first 3D game in the series. While Shadow and the Flame was a solid commercial success, 3D on the other hand wasn't, having a mixed critical and poor commercial reception. In 2001, however, the rights to the franchise were bought by Ubisoft, who had shown an interest in developing a Prince of Persia game of their own for some time. Ubisoft then rebooted the franchise and in 2003 released Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. And because of its success, Prince of Persia would end up growing as a franchise, spawning 2 sequels, a midquel, another reboot, a few spin-offs, a graphic novel, a movie, a 14-year-long abandonment of the franchise, and an upcoming remake which has been going through development hell. So yeah, I decided to sit down and take an in-depth look at this game, going through all of its different aspects to see exactly how well this game is held up. The game begins by immediately transitioning from menu to gameplay, which is neat, and it continues with the unnamed prince introducing himself and telling his story to a character off-screen. Now throughout the rest of the game, he serves as the narrator, sometimes giving additional information or insight into how he was feeling or what he was thinking at a specific point. I really like how the game can occasionally remind the player that all the events is just a story being told to someone, because whenever the player dies,
that didn't happen.
Saves...
Shall I continue my story from here the next time we're interrupted? Done. I'll start the story from here next time.
Or chooses to quit the game.
Do you wish me to leave before finishing my story? As you wish.
The prince will make a small comment. The prince and his father were on their way to visit Azad, but along the way they encountered Jafar. Now, small note, he isn't called Jafar in this game, he's referred to just as the Vizier, but I'm calling him Jafar because I think it's funny. Anyway, Jafar is the advisor to the Maharajah of India, and he ends up convincing the king of Persia to invade the Maharajah, mentioning that within his treasure vault are many riches and relics. The prince's father is intrigued with earning honor and glory, and so the Persian army attacks. The prince, being young, brash, and eager to prove himself to his father, he rides ahead recklessly in an attempt to reach the treasure vault first, and hopefully retrieves some kind of relic from within. And with that, the attack on the Maharajah's kingdom continues, and the game's tutorial begins.
Do you think I felt regret as I gazed upon the destruction we had wrought? Or at least humility at the speed with which a world can be transformed from a good world into a hell? If you think so, you are mistaken. For in that moment I thought of one thing only. The honor and glory I would bring my father by fighting like a warrior in my first battle.
So for the most part, the tutorial is okay, and it teaches the player all of the basics, how to move, how to fight, and how to platform. And I do have to say that the set piece of the city under siege for the beginning is pretty cool, and it does capture the player's attention immediately. Movement in Sands of Time is solid for the most part. The prince can climb up certain pieces of the environment, he can roll and jump across gaps, but something to note is that jumping and rolling are the same button, and that the prince will only jump if he's standing near a gap or a ledge. Just a small thing to keep in mind. And we also learn how to pull off some of the different parkour moves, such as the series' iconic wall run, jumping between pillars and between walls. Combat does change slightly after the tutorial, so I'll talk about it in greater detail a bit later on. But it's important to know that if the prince takes damage in any way, the way for him to heal is by finding any water source and then drinking from it. Eventually, the prince reaches the treasure vault and finds the Dagger of Time. The prince picks it up, and just as he does, a piece of the ceiling collapses and is about to fall on him. However, he had accidentally activated the dagger when he was looking at it, which then reversed time, allowing him to move out of the way. We then go back the way we came, and small detail, but because the prince had activated the dagger, one of the sand tanks which is used to rewind time is empty, which is pretty cool. The prince then presents the dagger to his father, after which Jafar then asks for the dagger as his share of the stolen treasure, but the king refuses and allows the prince to keep it for himself. We also see another of the relics that the Maharajah had, that being a giant hourglass which the king hopes to present to the Sultan of Azad as a gift. Arriving at Azad, and King Shahraman presents the Sultan with the before-mentioned hourglass and the sands of time that are inside. The Sultan is curious about the hourglass and why the sands inside are glowing, after which Jafar steps in and starts talking about the sands and the power that they have, all in an attempt to encourage the prince to use the dagger to unlock the hourglass, which the prince then does, and it doesn't go too well.
Is it meant to do this?
Also, my man was attacking sand with a sword, like, was that really gonna work? Jafar then uses his staff and does some weird ass magic to control the sand, and everyone in the palace then transforms into sand creatures. He demands the prince to give him the dagger, but the prince refuses and he manages to escape. We then have our very first encounter with the sand creatures, who are different from the human enemies we fought previously. The gimmick being that you won't be able to take them out with just the prince's sword. You'll only be able to knock them down, and you'll have to use the dagger to the sands and fully take them out. Combat isn't too complex, but it does offer a few different moves that the prince can pull off. When the prince is in combat, he will automatically lock on to the closest enemy, at which point, holding the stick in a certain direction and pressing the jump button, he can pull off a few different moves. Holding it left or right, the prince will dodge to the side. Holding it back, he'll perform a backflip, and pushing it forward, he can vault over an enemy and then follow it up with a pretty strong attack. The prince can also block and parry attacks, and when he's close to a wall, pressing the jump button, he can bounce off of it, performing this weird lunge attack. So, at first glance, combat looks to be pretty good, and as you keep progressing, you can eventually find a rhythm with it. And it does feel very satisfying to enter a flow state where you move from one enemy to the next and to the next. But there are three main things that sour the overall experience for me. The number of encounters, the length of the encounters, and the overall repetition of sand retrieval. Look, I understand the purpose of needing to retrieve the sands from the enemies in order to fully take them out. But I have to say that it gets tedious and annoying fairly quickly. I think that the mechanic in concept is okay, but playing through it and having to see the animation play dozens upon dozens of times, it kind of kills the flow of combat a little bit. And another issue that I have is the lack of enemy variety. Now, yes, enemies are slightly different. They have different models, animations, some of them can block your attacks more often, and there are a few enemies that can even counter your vaults. So yes, there is some enemy variety, but what I'm getting at is that, simply put, most enemies in the game are simply melee opponents. They don't have any special moves or abilities or anything that they can do to make them stand out or to make them more challenging to fight. The game also loves to spam you with dozens and dozens of enemies during fights, and combine that with you needing to perform sand retrieves very often, and that makes combat sections drag on much longer than they should. I don't hate the combat in Sands of Time, nor do I think it's bad, but playing through the game, I'd eventually get to a point where it starts feeling more like a chore, and that's not really a good thing. And also, that damn camera, I'll get to you soon. Moving through the palace, we try to find a woman who seems to be unaffected by the sands. And it's here that we can find two different upgrades that you can collect throughout the game. The first are these sand piles scattered throughout, which upon collecting 8 of them will add an additional sand tank. And the other are these weird hidden chambers. Walking up to the middle, you'll find a water shrine, and the prince will then drink from it, because of course he will, and doing so will increase his maximum health. So neither of these collectibles are very well hidden. Some of them are actually just straight up dead in the open and you can't really miss them. But they do encourage a bit of exploration of the palace, so at least there's that. And stepping briefly outside, we bear witness to 2 birds carrying the hourglass away to a tower off in the distance.
The hourglass? What? I did not understand the meaning of what I had just seen, but I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that those winged creatures had a master. The man who had tricked me into opening the hourglass now had his prize. And for some unknown purpose coveted the dagger as well, would stop at nothing to possess it. well, I would give him what he sought. I would plunge it into his foul and treacherous heart.
Finally catching up to the woman we saw before, we learn her name is Farah, and that she is the Maharajah's daughter, and she knows about the sands and the dagger.
Who are you?
I am Farah, the daughter of the Maharaja from whom you stole it. This is your doing.
I saw my father turn to sand.
And we will share his fate if you do not give me the dagger to undo what you have done.
Your traitorous vizier used the same words. From now on, I trust no one but myself.
We get attacked by a bunch of giant beetles, which means we split up from Farah, so we'll have to meet up with her later. Oh, and by the way, the reason why the sands didn't affect the prince, Farah, or Jafar was because each of them were in possession of an artifact that protected them, being the dagger, amulet, and walking stick, I guess. A major part of the gameplay is all the different time powers that the prince has at his disposal, because his butter knife can do a lot more than just suck up sand. The very first ability that we see and that we can use is the iconic Rewind. The dagger can rewind time up to 10 seconds in the past, which will reset the prince's position and his health, and even save him from death, thus allowing the player to fix their mistake during platforming or combat. To put it simply, I think that the Rewind is a really great mechanic, allowing players to make a few mistakes without breaking the flow of the game or having them stress about needing to completely restart whichever part they are currently at. It allows the game to have difficulty without it feeling unfair, and it encourages experimentation, especially during combat, trying different moves and seeing what might be the best strategy for your current situation. But the best part about the Rewind is definitely the way in which it's presented. Seeing everything briefly freeze and then start to slowly rewind, combined with the sound effects, it's just beautiful. Rewinding is a pretty powerful ability, so the amount that it can be used needs to be limited. The number of rewinds that the player can perform is determined by the number of sand tanks that they have and that are filled. Like I mentioned before, you can only rewind up to a maximum of 10 seconds, which is indicated by the small ring beneath the health bar. The only way to replenish the sand tank is by refilling the dagger with the sands of time, which can be acquired from enemies or the previously mentioned sand piles scattered throughout the game. Rewinding might be the main power of the dagger, but it isn't the only one that you have, as there are 3 more abilities that you'll unlock as you progress through the game. However, I really don't find myself using these other abilities that much, and I don't really have a straightforward answer as to why. They're just kind of mediocre, and 2 of them are kinda situational. These other abilities require power tanks to be used, which can be filled and created by retrieving sands from enemies. And the number of power tanks you can have corresponds to the number of sand tanks you have. So if you have 5 sand tanks, you'll have 5 power tanks, if you have 7, you'll have 7, and so on. The next ability you get is the power of delay, which can slow down time, allowing the prince to attack enemies and to get around traps more easily. However, the drawback is that it also slows down the prince. Simply put, I never use this ability because of that very reason, and also because the next ability you get is much better. The power of restraint allows you to temporarily freeze any enemy, after which you can then take them out by attacking them normally or performing a much quicker vault attack. And both the slowdown and freeze use only 1 power tank. The power of haste is the final and most powerful ability. After activating it, it will freeze every enemy on screen and then allow you to instantly take them out. However, it's a move that I used literally only once during my playthrough because of its massive requirement. Using this ability requires all of your sand tanks and power tanks to be full, and after you use it, it consumes all of your power tanks. Because of that, I feel that this ability is best used if you want to just skip a combat encounter, because aside from that, I never got any other incentive to use it. Overall, the time abilities are okay, but with there being only 4 abilities, you'd think that they would try to make all of them be pretty good and fun to use, but not really. The Rewind is definitely the best and most useful ability. As for the others, well, the freeze is probably second best, and it's handy for taking out enemies. The Mega Freeze, even if it is very costly, is useful if you're stuck on a certain combat encounter, but the slowdown is just complete shit, no other way to describe it. Moving on, we encounter the first major puzzle in the game. Now, quick note, none of the puzzles in the game are particularly difficult, so you won't have any problems with solving them. That means that their main purpose is to just break up the pace of gameplay so that it isn't constantly just combat and platforming, which I'm fine with. The purpose of this puzzle is to activate the palace's defense system, in hopes that doing so will hopefully fend off and maybe kill some of the sand monsters. Unfortunately, the only thing that it ends up doing is making it harder for yourself, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't really do anything for the sand creatures, which is just great because they can teleport, so that's fantastic. It's incredibly simple. You just have to turn some levers which move some pillars, and you have to put them into their correct spots. By the way, if you're worried that you made a mistake during this puzzle, don't worry, because the game will subtly tell you if you did.
Careful! Think ahead!
So like I mentioned, from here on out, all the traps for the palace are activated, which is just great. Occasionally you'll come across these trap gauntlets, where you'll need to pull a lever and then reach the end of this said gauntlet, usually of a hallway, in under a time limit. They can be pretty tricky, and I'll be honest, successfully maneuvering through all the traps and finally rolling through the door at the end just as it's about to close is an incredibly satisfying feeling. Traps have been an iconic aspect of the Prince of Persia series since the very beginning, and here they are in Sands of Time. One thing I will give this game credit though is that they actually give an in-world explanation for why all the traps exist and how they are activated. Something that even later games would sort of glance over and not give much thought, except for like maybe a passing line or something. Although I will admit, some of these traps are really ridiculous, both in their design and their placement. Like, what the hell is even this? A sideways bear trap? I don't even know. But I will mention that the traps and trap gauntlets can be pretty difficult. And as you progress through the game, performing a flawless run with perfect timing and without taking any damage can be very challenging. We catch up to Farah, who we see fighting off some sand creatures, and the prince then drops down with a really wonky looking animation in order to help her. However, he discovers that one of the sand creatures is actually his own father, and he's going to have to fight him. Now, Sands of Time doesn't have that many boss fights. Actually, it only has 2, and I use the term very loosely, because neither of them are particularly difficult, nor are they really that good. The first one is just annoying, mostly because of its placement in the game, and the second one, well, you'll see for yourself when we get to it. So, what are some things that I like about this boss? Well, I think that he's got a really cool design, and that's about it. Yep. Let's just get this out of the way. Throwing this boss at this early point in the game with the player having low health, only a few sand tanks, and the weakest sword in the game, well, all of that together certainly makes for a combination that makes this a pretty challenging encounter. He is not a walk in the park. He takes a considerable amount of damage, and he can really smack you around if you're not careful and paying attention. However, you're not fighting him alone, because there are a bunch of other sand creatures that you're also going to have to fight, which is pretty great. And another thing is that this boss is also an introduction to a new enemy type, which is the blue enemies, the main thing being that you can't vault over them, because trying to do so will have them counter and just toss your ass to the ground, which takes away a tiny bit of health. Now there are only 2 blue enemies in the game, the spear enemies and the big sword boys. Now the spear boys are difficult, but there are certain tactics that you can use to quickly dispatch them, such as performing a counter retrieve. But the big sword boys are easily the hardest enemy type in the game, and defeating them can require a bit of experimentation. Also, a thing that I think I forgot to mention is that when the prince is knocked down, you'll have to manually press the jump button to get him to get back up. However, if he is knocked down to the ground, he can still block attacks. Even though the blue enemies will counter you, you can still vault over them using 3 methods. By freezing them, you can perform a vaulting attack, instantly killing them. You can slow down time and perform a vault, and you can also do an off-the-wall jump, which will then transition into a vault attack. But yeah, back to the boss. So my main advice for dealing with him is just to focus on all the other enemies. After you deal with a certain amount of them, they'll eventually stop spawning, allowing you to focus on the main man himself, because once it's one-on-one, it gets much easier. It's not a walk in the park, but it is much easier. So after that boss fight, and you finally take him out, the prince then runs into a sand column where he sees that the hourglass was taken to the Tower of Dawn.
I'm sorry.
Why?
I know what it is to lose a father.
That was not my father.
What are you doing? Stop!
Now, I didn't mention it before, but the sand columns, which function as save points, also give the prince a vision of the future, showing what he'll need to do to progress through an area. They don't have any kind of lore explanation as far as I know, they just sort of exist. Now, as for the visions themselves, they do feel a little bit handholdy, but I can see how they might be useful if someone is playing the game and then they quit and need a quick refresher on what they're supposed to do. So overall, not the biggest fan, but I can understand why it might be useful, and thankfully you can skip them. Something you might have noticed is that after the fight, the prince's sleeve gets torn off. As you progress through the game, the prince's clothes get more and more damaged and his body eventually gets covered in scars. Personally, I really love when a game changes a character's appearance, serving as a visual indicator to show the player how far they have progressed, but also how much the events of the game have affected and taken a physical toll on the protagonist. He tells Farah where the hourglass is, and she says that in order to undo the chaos that the sands have unleashed, we need to get to the hourglass and use the dagger, and so with that we have our objective and our destination. From here on out, we have Farah with us as a companion, not for the entirety of the game, as we will end up splitting up with her a few more times, but it is quite a major part of the game. So before I talk about her, I have to mention that, in general, companions in games often have a pretty bad reputation. Mostly because you constantly need to babysit them and make sure they don't get killed, which depending on the game can either be mildly annoying or a major pain in the ass. Suffice to say that if you have a non-player controlled character that you need to escort throughout the game, it can be pretty challenging. Now, yes, there are some games that have companions that aren't horrible, either because they don't move or act unless the player tells them to, because they only follow you for a small section of the game, or in my opinion the laziest, they're just invincible. Farah, however, in this game, isn't too bad. Now during combat, enemies will usually focus on you, but if they do decide to attack her, she can defend herself and also help you out by shooting at enemies with her bow. If an enemy does end up attacking her, you will need to step in, as she doesn't have a whole lot of health, and especially if she's fighting some of the more tougher enemies. However, a thing that ends up saving Sands of time is that if she does die or if she's close to death, you can rewind and then quickly act to help her out. Meaning that when it comes to combat, it isn't horrible as long as you keep an eye on her and as long as you're aware of everything that's going on. As for her bow, it doesn't do a whole lot of damage to enemies, meaning that it isn't really game-changing, but it is nice that she can help you out. For example, if there are any enemies near you, she can shoot at them and temporarily stun them. And a small thing to note is that she can also hit you with her arrows, which is great. Apart from combat, she does also help out during puzzles, but all of that is scripted, so no real comment to be made on it. Although, I have to say the best part about her being a companion and tagging along is the banter and occasional bickering between her and the prince.
I thought I'd make sure it was safe first before I brought you up.
I'll bet.
The relationship between the two of them is a major aspect of the game, seeing how it evolves and develops as you progress through the story, where at first they don't trust each other, and they believe that they don't need the other's help. But over time their relationship changes and eventually develops into both of them having romantic feelings for each other. As for the romance between them, I can't really speak on it as I'm not a fan of romance stories, therefore I'm a bit biased against them. But what I can say is that it feels a little forced, but in general, I think that it's a sweet and nice dynamic between them. So yeah, overall, Farah is a decent companion, and it's nice to have her along. She's not revolutionary in terms of a companion or a follower, but she's alright. And I have no real major complaints, except for her being able to hit you with her arrows. That is really stupid and annoying. But yeah, with Farah with us, from here on out, the Tower of Dawn is the main destination, and the Prince and Farah will need to go through multiple different areas of the palace in order to get there, with each location having a different design, but offering a mixture of parkour, traps, puzzles, and combat. The next area appears to be some sort of warehouse or storeroom, which has this weird staircase puzzle that rotates after you pull a lever. I mean, I struggle to call this a puzzle because of how just simple it really is. You just pull on levers one after the other. But at least it shows the prince and Farah working together. This then moves on to the palace's zoo, and it's here we fight the birds that have been corrupted by the sands. Yes, human-type creatures aren't the only enemies you'll end up fighting, as there are some animal enemies in the game, those being the scarabs, bats, and birds. Now the scarabs are completely trivial because you can easily swat them away with your sword, but the birds and bats suck ass. With the bats, you need to stop dead in your tracks and keep swatting at them with your sword until the few that are alive get the memo and just decide to finally piss off. And the birds, just wow. When you're on the ground, it's okay, you just need to block them and then smack them once and they're done. But there's a section later on in the game where the prince needs to carefully balance on a beam or he'll fall off. And also, drawing his sword makes him move about as slow as a goddamn snail, and you keep getting pecked at by these damn birds and constantly falling off of these damn beams. It's just not a very fun section. It's really not. So after talking about combat, traps, and puzzles, I can now finally talk about the last major aspect of Prince of Persia, which is parkour and freerunning. Putting it plainly, it's an incredibly simple system, as you use only 2 buttons to pull off all the different moves, that being a jump button and a special action button. As for the moves that you can perform, that includes the iconic wall run, swinging off of poles and ropes, jumping between walls, and jumping between pillars. You can see how the freerunning and parkour in this game would eventually end up inspiring Assassin's Creed. Now, even though the system is simple, it does get pretty challenging and difficult, as the player will need to focus on getting their timing right, which can sometimes be pretty tricky, as with these wall jumps. Now, I myself didn't have too much trouble with this, and I was able to pull it off pretty regularly, but from what I've seen of other people's gameplay, they struggle pretty heavily on this part. Which, I don't know whether it's due to the game being kind of old and not running that well in modern systems, or if it's just them not being able to get the timing right on the jumps. But it is something to keep in mind that even though it's simple, it's not easy, and it can get pretty difficult and challenging. Also throw in the traps like I mentioned earlier on, and the freerunning and parkour mechanics. Overall, they're easily my favorite part about this game. But the best aspect of the parkour for me is definitely the quality of the animations. They are incredibly well done, and not just for the parkour, but also for the combat. So overall, all I can say is just major kudos to the animators, because I could watch the Prince freerun and parkour for hours. That's how amazing it is. The only exception I would give is definitely for the Prince's running animation, especially when he goes downstairs, because sometimes it can look a little... yeah. The next area has another puzzle, which isn't that difficult. All you have to do is push a statue, pull a few levers, which will then open a trap door, so you can then push a block through to reach a high ledge, that then lets you acquire a brand new sword. Now, over the course of the game, the prince will acquire 3 new swords, with each one having higher damage, and the first one letting you break through certain weak walls. Remember when upgrades were acquired by simply playing the game and progressing through the story, and acquiring said upgrades actually made you feel more powerful? Now, acquiring a new sword is really cool, but what isn't is this game's camera. If I had to choose one thing about this game that I would say is straight up bad, it's gotta be the camera, because this damn thing clearly has a mind of its own. It regularly changes between following the prince in a standard third-person perspective and moving into a fixed angle. Now, this is usually done in order to give the player a better view so they can see what they're doing and where they need to go, and it's mostly used during platforming. For those moments, it's fine, and I don't have an issue with it during those parts. My problem with the camera is when it comes to combat. During combat, you will get these drastic camera changes, usually when you perform a vault or retrieve sand from an enemy. And I'm guessing that this happens in order to give the game a cinematic flourish, I suppose, but honestly, having the camera just swing around quite regularly is more distracting than anything. So, camera angle changes during combat, fine. It's cinematic, it doesn't happen all the time, but it still happens enough times for it to be an annoyance, but I can ignore it after playing through the game for a while. But do you want to know the nail that seals the coffin for the camera for me? It's that it gets caught in the environment all the damn time, because the camera behaves like a physical object, which means that when you rotate the camera, it can collide with the environment, at which point it will bounce off and snap into a different position while playing this whoosh sound that you're going to hear so many damn times. The camera is definitely the weakest part of Sands of Time, and it's the main thing that I'm super glad that they fixed in the sequels going forward, because, man, I was not expecting it to be this bad. The next few areas don't really have anything too interesting to talk about. We encounter the big blue sword enemies for the first time, and then we have this part where we have to rotate this bridge, and that's about all worth mentioning. A bit later on, we get separated from Farah, so we're going to have to go through the cave system beneath the palace and then through the sewers in order to reach the bats and reunite with her. So in order to actually enter the cave system, we have to first open up a gate, and this is the part where the prince needs to balance on those poles and he gets attacked by the birds. Yeah, this section is not that great. We open the gate and head inside. The caverns are alright, they're at least different from all the other locations, and there's also some pretty fun platforming, with having to run across wooden platforms and jump between stalactites before they break. Not that bad. There is one side thing that I want to talk about. I mentioned earlier that how the prince heals is by drinking water. What I didn't mention, however, is that this can be done from any water source. Any water source. Pond water, bath water, cave water, sewer water, water from a random waterfall on this cliffside. This man does not care. He will gladly take a massive gulp from any aquatic liquid that's available to him. I guess we're supposed to be under the impression that all the water he drinks is clean. I mean, I sure hope it is, because otherwise... We then reach the sewers, which I just found out by looking at the wiki that it's not the sewers, but it's actually an underground reservoir that provides the palace with clean drinking water. So there you go. At least we know this water is clean. Similar to the caverns, this area also stands out by its overall design in comparison to the other locations. Nothing much else of note though, it's just alright. The only thing to mention is the introduction to rope swinging, which is a bit finicky to control. And it looks kind of awkward. Not a fan of rope swinging. Also, side note, the first time I played, I legit got stuck at this section for like 20 minutes, until I realized that at this rope, you're not supposed to swing, but climb up to get out of the reservoir and up to the surface. Looking back at it, I feel like an idiot. I think now's the time that I talk about the game's music. The soundtrack for Sands of Time was composed by Stuart Chatwood, who would also end up being the composer for the next 3 games in the series. And while he eventually quit the Prince of Persia series, he would still compose for video games, as he would go on to do the soundtrack for Darkest Dungeon and its sequel, which I have not played, nor have I heard any of its music. If anyone has, you let me know if it's any good. Basing it on his work on Prince of Persia, I have a feeling that it's pretty good. Back to Sands of Time though, while not my favorite soundtrack of the franchise, this one is still really incredible. The music in general has this, I don't really want to say stereotypical, so let's say ancient Middle Eastern aesthetic. But the best part definitely is whenever a certain track is shaken up with a more modern instrument. Reaching the bats, we reunite with Farah and fight off some more sand creatures, after which the prince walks into a sand column and gets another vision, and while he's unconscious, he hears Farah let her feelings for him slip.
My love, please don't leave me.
What did you call me?
It doesn't matter. The important thing is, I know how we can reach the Tower of Dawn.
Of course, the hourglass. All right. But this time, stay with me and pay attention. Can't spend all day chasing after you.
We then move on to the library, and this area is a pretty big one, having multiple combat encounters, a lot of platforming, and a puzzle where you have to redirect a beam of light by moving and rotating mirrors. Bit of a side tangent, but have you ever noticed how there are quite a lot of games that have either light or lasers that you need to redirect with mirrors? I don't have any problem with these puzzles, it was just something that I realized when I first got to this area. Completing the light puzzle, we acquire our second sword, and then move on to the observatory, which has us rotating levers which rotates these replica celestial bodies, so that we can swing off of these poles and leave. It's nothing complex or difficult, but it's a nice little way to conclude the library portion. And while the library isn't my personal favorite location, I think it's pretty good and I like it well enough. Now, I wanted to talk about the game's aesthetic and its graphics in general. The game has more of a stylized art style, which is pretty noticeable from looking at the human characters in the game. But I think that the game looks best when it comes to its environments and level design, because all of the locations look really beautiful. The major thing that makes the visuals look so great is the game's lighting. The entire game has this sort of warm glow and color palette, and this might be a bit weird, but it sort of reminds me of a lot of classical oil paintings, if that makes any sense. And the game's atmosphere is also just fantastic. Seeing all these massive locations that would usually be filled with dozens of people just being empty and barren really gives a feeling of unease, but also a sense of peacefulness. And small details like seeing all the sand just floating around, the dagger glowing when you stand near it, and banners lightly billowing is really cool. As for the character models, overall, they're fine. Farah and the Vizier are both okay, but the Prince definitely got the short end of the stick. I can't really explain it, but the Prince's face, whenever he drastically emotes, he just looks a little ridiculous. The sand creatures, however, definitely have the best designs in the game, hands down. Mostly because the game's art style allows their features like their glowing eyes and mouths to pop out a lot more. Exiting back outside, we fight through some more enemies and do some more platforming, and find that we're pretty close to the Tower of Dawn. But in order to reach it, we need to get across a bridge. However, just as the prince walks across, it ends up collapsing and sends him falling into the prison beneath the palace. Which is really unfortunate. I mean, it'd be really useful if he had some kind of ability that would allow him to reverse time, right? Shame that he doesn't, though. Aside from that slight tangent, I really enjoyed this section. I like the area, I like the platforming, the combat portion is pretty great, and also this area has what is without a doubt my favorite music track in the entire game. Now, I didn't talk about the soundtrack in too much detail, mostly because music isn't something that I have a lot of knowledge about, and I don't really know how to comment on it in great detail, so I just kind of gave you my Cliff Notes version. So, like I said, the soundtrack as a whole is really great, and all the other combat tracks are really good, but this one in particular, I don't know, it just tickles my brain in just the right way that I can't really explain. I don't know, maybe I'm just a sucker for a good electric guitar. Only complaint that I have is that this track is used only once in the entire game from what I recall, and it's only this one combat section. After that, yeah, you never hear it again, which kind of sucks. And sadly, this area only lasts for a few more minutes, and before you know it, we've climbed back out. Yeah, my favorite section in the game, and it lasts like, what, 10-15 minutes? That kinda sucks. If anything, the prison, or dungeon, whatever you want to call it, was a nice atmospheric contrast with the rest of the palace. Give me a glimpse at some of the brutality and violence that's hidden beneath the more somber and elegant design of the rest of the palace, and also getting a look at the atmospheric direction the sequel would end up taking. We climb out, help Farah fight off some enemies, and finally make it to the Tower of Dawn. We head on inside and begin riding an elevator up, but unfortunately we get ambushed by a bunch of enemies, and this is definitely the hardest combat section of the whole game. Once all the enemies are dead, we arrive at the top and find the hourglass. The prince then climbs on top and is about to insert the dagger, but just before he does, he hesitates and starts questioning Farah and why he should trust her. This allows Jafar to show up and do some airbending, which sends the prince and Farah flying out of a window and into a tomb below.
My father's army sacked your palace, captured you as a slave.
What?
You have every reason to hate me.
What are you talking about?
Now you want me to trust you.
Go on. There's no time.
Give me the dagger.
The dagger! He must not get the dagger!
I had faced my enemy. I had looked into his eyes, and I had lost everything.
Farah is reasonably pretty upset for why the prince hesitated, and she asks him why he didn't trust her. And here we get to see the prince in a pretty weak, vulnerable, and even scared state. He screwed up, and he needs to take a moment to reflect on that. The prince is a pretty interesting character. He's a sarcastic and stubborn person, and his main journey, aside from saving everyone, is to learn and grow as an individual. Now, I wouldn't say that his character nor his character arc are revolutionary in terms of writing, but Sands of Time is ultimately a story about an arrogant and brash young man who ends up making a massive mistake, and who then tries to do whatever he can to fix said mistake. The prince is someone who regularly screws up. He struggles, he fails, and even when he eventually does fix things by the end, he doesn't get a perfect and happy ending. Farah shares some similarities with the prince. She's clearly a competent individual, however her flaw is that she believes that she can fix the disaster caused by the sands and reach the hourglass by herself. And her failure to realize that she can't is sadly what gets her killed in the end. And something that they both need to learn is that the two of them on their own are skilled and capable, however, they can't do it on their own, and they need to help each other. The difficulty of being able to admit that you shouldn't or can't do something on your own, and accepting another person's help in whatever situation you're in, is something that I think quite a few people struggle and can relate with. As for Jafar, he doesn't really have a character, so there's not much to say about him. He's really just an antagonist for the sake of having an antagonist. And while his reason and motivation for wanting the hourglass and its power might seem reasonable because he is sick and dying, and so he wants to gain immortality and in doing so cure himself, this ends up getting changed in a later game to him just wanting power and control, so Farah then decides to tell the prince a secret word that her mother told her when she was younger, where if she was ever afraid, she just had to say the word Kakolukium and a magic door would open. The prince says the word and Farah stops talking, so when we're cured of our blindness and get control back of the prince, we find that she disappeared and that a door has opened, so we have to go and find her. We go down this very long staircase. Very, very, very long staircase that just keeps going and going and going and still going, and I have really nothing else to say other than it's just a long staircase, and I'm really just stretching this joke out until we can make it to the end. Finally reaching the bottom, and we get to the Lost Woods section of the game. No, but like actually, because you have to listen for the sound of water and then walk through the correct path in order to progress. Sure, I don't really get this section, man, it's just weird as hell. We find Farah taking a bath for some reason, and she invites the prince to join, which he does, removing his weapons, but not his clothes for some reason. Okay, and the two of them then proceed to make love. The prince wakes up, and even he is confused on what the hell just happened and whether it happened at all. He finds that while he was asleep, however, Farah had taken his sword and the dagger, and that she plans to go to the hourglass by herself. She had left him her amulet, however, so that he doesn't get sandized, so we need to run after her. Some enemies do show up, but all you have to do is just walk right past them because, you can't do anything else. We then have one more mirror puzzle, and completing it lets us grab the strongest sword in the game, which can kill any enemy in one hit. The final section of the game has you manually scaling the Tower of Dawn, and encountering the occasional groups of enemies. However, lacking the Dagger of Time, you won't be able to rewind or use the other time abilities. I'm guessing that because they took away the dagger, they wanted to balance it out and not make the final section too annoying or difficult, which is why they gave the player the powerful one-hit sword. When it comes to the actual climb up the tower, it isn't too difficult, but without being able to rewind, it will require quite a bit of patience and perfect timing, especially for these wall-to-wall jumps. But the best part about the final section is definitely the atmosphere. Listening to the sound of the wind blowing is really great. Overall, it's a nice final set piece to finish up the game. We reach the top and find Farah fighting against some sand creatures. The prince steps in to help, but she gets knocked off and is just about to fall, but the prince grabs onto the dagger. Farah, realizing that the prince won't let go and that he won't be able to save her, she decides to let go of the dagger and in doing so falls to her death, and the prince is pretty upset. We then have one final combat section against the toughest enemies in the game, but it isn't that difficult thankfully due to the powerful sword that you acquired. Jafar then shows up out of nowhere and tries to trick the prince one last time by offering him immortality in exchange for the dagger. The prince refuses, climbs on top of the hourglass, and in rage slams the dagger into it, returning all the sand to the hourglass and in doing so triggers a grand rewind. The prince wakes up and finds that he has been sent back in time to before his father's army had attacked India, but with the Dagger of Time still in his possession. And before I continue, I have one small issue. How does the prince have the dagger? Because at this point in time, he didn't have it. It was in the vault in the palace. Is that dagger still in the vault? Did it teleport? Are there now 2 daggers? I get that I'm probably not supposed to think about this too much and just ignore it, but I don't know, it seems like a major plot hole that I'm supposed to just completely ignore for some reason. But aside from that plot hole, the prince runs off to the Maharajah's palace to return the Dagger of Time. He reaches the palace and finds Farah, at which point he begins saying the exact same lines that are from the very beginning of the game.
The Dagger of Time. But it is locked away within my father's treasure vault. How?
Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong.
Yeah, it turns out that the person the prince was talking to the entire time was actually Farah herself, because due to her dying and then time rewinding, she doesn't remember anything. The prince then tries to return the dagger to her, and he tells her to warn her father about Jafar. But, look who shows up. So, this is the final fight, and you finally get to face off against Jafar, and it is completely fucking horrible. All he does is just stand there and copy-paste himself. That's it. I mean, do you want to see the entire fight uncut and just sped up? What a pathetic final boss. The prince kills Jafar and returns the dagger to Farah, who sadly doesn't believe his story. The prince then begins to leave, but just before he does, Farah asks for his name, to which he simply responds with Kakolukyam. And so the game ends in a pretty bittersweet way. I have to say that I really like this ending. Even though the prince ended up saving everyone and ended up changing and growing as a person, he didn't really get a perfect and happy ending. And how his actions, involuntary or not, did have consequences. And even though he eventually ended up fixing everything by the end, the prince's screwing with time would result in something much worse. Something hunting him. Something he wasn't expecting and which he certainly wasn't prepared for. So, in conclusion, I have to say that I really like Sands of Time. I think it's a great game, but I wouldn't necessarily consider it a masterpiece, mostly because some of the gameplay aspects of it do fall short in my opinion, mostly the combat. The puzzles and platforming are both pretty good, but the combat itself falls a bit flat. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if this game was just a one-off, and it wasn't part of a franchise, I probably would have liked it a lot more. But that's not what happened, because a sequel would end up releasing in just 1 year, and I think it's safe to say that that sequel would end up making some drastic changes. And depending on who you are, you might think that those changes were for better or for worse. But in the end, I see it as a fun, albeit fairly standard swashbuckling adventure, which has some time travel elements mixed in to make it a bit more unique and interesting. Now, on the question of whether I would recommend this game, definitely. But the choice on whether you wish to play it and whether you'll actually end up liking it, well, that's ultimately up to you, because I understand and respect that people have different tastes and opinions. And one thing that I'm not here to do is to force my opinions on you. If you dislike this game and don't want to play it for whatever reason, then that's perfectly fine. But either way, I'm glad that you decided to sit through this video nonetheless. But I am curious to know what your thoughts are on Sands of Time, whether you played it or not. Did you play it when it first came out back in 2003, or did you only play it more recently? And if you have, then did you enjoy it or not? And if you made it to the end of this video, then all I really have to say is thanks. I'm kind of tired of recording all this, and I really hope to just finish this up. But thanks for watching. That's all from me, and have a nice day.